The howling wind outside my one-room schoolhouse in Nome carried the scent of death that February morning in 1946, and I should have known it was warning me of what was coming. Ice crystals danced against the frost-covered windows like tiny spirits, trying to break through, while the old wood stove crackled desperately against the 40-below temperature that had settled over our isolated town like a curse. 23 small desks sat in neat rows before me, each one occupied by the children who depended on me for more than just reading and arithmetic. I was their anchor in this frozen wasteland at the edge of the world. My breath formed clouds. In the bitter air, as I called roll, my voice echoing off the wooden walls that had witnessed countless harsh winters before this one. The children's faces were red from the cold walk to school, their mittened hands clutching pencils that barely wrote in the frigid air. But as my eyes swept across the familiar faces, bundled in layers of wool and fur, my heart stopped. Little Sarah McKinnon's desk in the third row sat empty, her small wooden chair pushed neatly under the scarred desktop. What I didn't know then was that this empty desk would lead me into the longest, darkest night of my life, and that before it was over, I would discover secrets about Nome that some people would kill to keep buried. Sarah McKinnon was 8 years old, with cornflower blue eyes and braids so blonde they looked like spun moonlight against her red woolen coat. She lived with her grandfather, old Henrik, in a cabin 2 miles north of town, where the wind never stopped singing its mournful song through the gaps in the chinked logs. Henrik was a prospector from the Gold Rush days, a man whose weathered hands told stories of fortunes found and lost in the frozen streams around Nome. The old Norwegian had raised Sarah since she was 3, after her parents died in a fishing accident out on the Bering Sea. Every morning for the past 2 years, Sarah had walked the treacherous path from their cabin to my schoolhouse, her small boots following the same frozen ruts that countless other children had worn into the permafrost. She was never late, never missed a day, not even during the worst blizzards when other children stayed home. Her dedication to learning was fierce, almost desperate, as if education was her lifeline to a world beyond the endless white expanse that surrounded us. But that morning, her absence felt like a wound in the fabric of our small community. I tried to focus on the lesson, teaching the children about geography, while my mind wandered to Sarah's empty chair. The other students seemed restless too, their eyes drifting to the vacant spot as if they could feel the wrongness of it. 10-year-old Tommy Erickson raised his hand and asked in his high, clear voice, "Miss Catherine, where's Sarah today?" The question hung in the cold air like a challenge I wasn't prepared to answer. I told them she was probably just delayed by the weather, but even as the words left my lips, I knew they were lies. Sarah McKinnon had walked through blizzards that would stop a grown man, had trudged through snowdrifts taller than herself, had never once let the brutal Alaska winter keep her from her studies. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and the knot of fear in my stomach grew tighter with each passing minute. The children sensed my unease, their young faces reflecting the worry I was trying so hard to hide. By noon, when Sarah still hadn't appeared, I made a decision that would change everything. I dismissed the class early, watching as the children bundled up against the fierce wind and scattered toward their homes like leaves before a storm. The temperature had dropped even further, and the sky had taken on that peculiar gray-white color that promised more snow before nightfall. I wrapped my heaviest shawl around my shoulders, pulled on my fur-lined boots, and stepped out into the howling wilderness that surrounded Nome. The wind hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath and driving ice crystals into my exposed skin like tiny needles. The town's few wooden buildings huddled together against the vast emptiness, their chimney smoke whipped away by the relentless wind before it could offer any comfort. I had lived in Nome for 3 years, had thought I understood the harsh realities of life in this remote outpost, but nothing had prepared me for what I was about to discover. As I began the 2-mile walk to old Henrik's cabin, I had no idea that I was walking straight into a nightmare that would test everything I believed about the people I thought I knew. The path to the McKinnon cabin was barely visible under the fresh snow, marked only by a few weathered stakes that Henrik had driven into the ground to guide travelers during the worst storms. Each step forward was a battle against the wind, which seemed determined to push me back toward town, as if nature itself was warning me to turn around. The silence between gusts was profound and unsettling, broken only by the crunch of my boots. On the frozen snow and the distant howl of sled dogs somewhere in the white expanse, pine trees lined the path, their branches heavy with snow and ice, creating a tunnel of white that seemed to stretch into infinity. The cold was so intense it made my lungs ache with each breath, and I pulled my scarf higher over my face to protect against frostbite. But I pressed on, driven by a teacher's instinct that something had happened to one of her students, a feeling so strong it overrode every rational thought about the danger I was putting myself in. The landscape around me was beautiful and terrible, a reminder of how small and vulnerable we humans were in the face of nature's power. With each step, I could feel the weight of the approaching darkness. For in February in Nome, the sun set early, and the night lasted forever. Old Henrik's cabin appeared through the swirling snow like a mirage, its single window glowing with warm yellow light that should have been welcoming but instead filled me with dread. The small structure sat in a clearing surrounded by towering spruce trees, their branches creating a natural windbreak that made the silence even more profound. Smoke rose from the chimney in a straight line before being caught by the wind and scattered across the darkening sky. I could see Henrik's sled dogs in their pen beside the cabin, huddled together against the cold. But they didn't bark at my approach as they usually did. Something about their silence made my skin crawl, as if even the animals sensed that something was terribly wrong. I knocked on the wooden door, my knuckles numb despite my thick mittens, and called out Henrik's name. The sound of my voice seemed to be swallowed by the vast emptiness around us. And for a moment I wondered if anyone would ever find me if something happened here, so far from town. When the door finally opened, I saw old Henrik's face, and I knew immediately that my worst fears were about to be confirmed. Henrik's weathered face was gray with worry, his usually bright blue eyes dulled with a pain I had never seen before. He stood in the doorway like a broken man, his shoulders slumped under the weight of some terrible burden, and I could see his hands shaking as he gripped the door frame. "Miss Catherine," he said, his Norwegian accent thicker than usual, "I was hoping Sarah had gone to school early. Maybe helped you with something." His voice trailed off as he saw the answer in my eyes. Behind him, the cabin's interior looked ransacked, with furniture overturned and blankets scattered across the floor, as if someone had searched frantically for something. Or someone. The smell of cold fear permeated the small space, mixing with the scent of wood smoke and the lingering aroma of the morning's coffee. I stepped inside without invitation, my teacher's instincts taking over as I surveyed the chaos. "When did you last see her, Henrik?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. The old man's face crumpled, and I realized I was looking at a man who had lost everything that mattered to him in this harsh, unforgiving world. "She went to bed same as always," Henrik whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind that rattled the cabin's windows. "I checked on her before I banked the fire for the night, and she was sleeping peaceful as an angel. But when I went to wake her this morning—" He couldn't finish the sentence, his throat working soundlessly as tears froze on his cheeks. I moved toward the small alcove where Sarah slept, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Her bed was empty, the quilts thrown back as if she had gotten up suddenly in the middle of the night. The window above her bed was slightly open, just enough for a small person to squeeze through, and snow had blown in to dust the wooden floor beneath it. I ran my fingers along the windowsill and felt something that made my blood turn to ice. Fresh, scratch marks in the wood, as if someone had forced the window open from the outside. Henrik saw me examining the marks, and his face went white as the snow outside. "There's something else, Miss Catherine," he said, his voice shaking with more than just cold. "Something I should have told you before. Something about why we really came to Nome." As darkness began to fall over the endless white landscape, I realized that Sarah McKinnon's disappearance was not just a tragic accident or a child's misguided adventure into the frozen wilderness. The scratch marks on the window, the ransacked cabin, and the fear in old Henrik's eyes all pointed to something far more sinister, something that suggested Sarah had been taken, not lost. The wind outside grew stronger, howling around the cabin like the voices of all the ghosts that haunted this remote corner of Alaska, and I felt the weight of the approaching night pressing down on us like a physical presence. Henrik's words about secrets hung in the air between us, heavy with the promise of revelations that would change everything I thought I knew about this quiet old man and his granddaughter. I looked out the window at the vast expanse of white that stretched to the horizon, knowing that somewhere in that frozen wilderness, a little girl was facing the most dangerous night of her life. The temperature was still dropping, the wind was getting stronger, and in a few hours it would be too dark and too cold for anyone to survive outside. But as I prepared to make the most important decision of my life, whether to return to town for help or begin searching immediately, I had no idea that I was about to uncover a web of lies, betrayal, and murder that reached into the very heart of Nome's founding families. The secret Henrik was about to reveal would have to wait, because at that moment, I heard something that made every instinct in my body scream with urgency. The faint sound of a child crying, carried on the wind from somewhere beyond the cabin. I held up my hand to silence the old man, my ears straining against the howling gale that surrounded us like a living thing. There it was again, barely audible but unmistakably human, a sound so fragile it seemed it might be torn away by the next gust of Arctic wind. Henrik heard it too, his weathered face transforming from despair to desperate hope in the space of a heartbeat. We both rushed to the door, throwing it open despite the blast of frigid air that invaded the warm cabin. Like an icy fist, the sound came again, closer this time, and I realized it wasn't crying at all. It was someone calling for help, their voice raw and broken from fighting against the storm. But as we peered into the swirling white darkness beyond the cabin's reach, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Something about that voice didn't sound right, didn't sound like Sarah at all, and the way it seemed to move around us in the wind made the hair on the back of my neck stand up like the hackles of a frightened dog. We grabbed lanterns and plunged into the storm, following the sound that seemed to dance just ahead of us through the trees. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that obscured our vision and muffled our calls as we shouted Sarah's name into the howling darkness. My lantern cast a weak yellow circle of light that barely penetrated the wall of white surrounding us, and I could feel panic rising in my chest as the voice led us deeper into the forest. Henrik moved beside me with surprising agility for his age, his prospector's instincts guiding him through terrain that would have been treacherous, even in daylight. The temperature had dropped so low that my breath came out in thick clouds that froze instantly on my scarf, and I could feel the cold seeping through my layers of wool and fur like ice water in my veins. We followed what might have been a trail, though it was impossible to tell where the path ended and the wilderness began in the shifting, swirling snow. Each step took us further from the safety of the cabin, further into a landscape that could kill us as easily as breathing. But the voice kept calling, always just out of reach, and I knew we had no choice but to follow it wherever it might lead, even if it led us straight into the heart of the frozen hell that was an Alaskan winter night. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, we emerged into a small clearing where the wind had swept most of the snow away, revealing the dark frozen ground beneath. In the beam of my lantern, I saw something that made my heart leap. Footprints, small and delicate, pressed deep into the frost-hardened earth. "Sarah!" Henrik cried, his voice cracking with emotion as he dropped to his knees beside the tracks. But as I knelt down to examine them more closely, holding my lantern low to cast the best light possible, I noticed details that made my teacher's mind race with questions. The footprints were indeed small, but they were wearing boots. Heavy, adult-sized boots that no 8-year-old child should have been able to walk in. More disturbing still, there were other tracks alongside Sarah's. Larger prints that belonged to someone wearing snowshoes, someone who had been following the child through the forest. The pattern told a story that chilled me more than the Arctic. Wind. Someone had taken Sarah from her bed, forced her to walk through the wilderness in boots too big for her feet, and led her toward some unknown destination in the middle of the worst storm of the winter. I looked up at Henrik, about to share my observations, but the words died in my throat when I saw his face in the lantern light. He was staring at the larger tracks with an expression of recognition and terror that told me he knew exactly who had taken his granddaughter. "Henrik," I said carefully, my voice barely audible above the wind, "who made these tracks?" The old man's face had gone ashen, his eyes wide with a fear that seemed to go deeper than worry for Sarah's safety. He stood up slowly, his arthritic joints protesting against the cold, and for a moment I thought he might collapse under the weight of whatever knowledge was eating away at him. "We have to go back," he whispered, his Norwegian accent so thick I could barely understand him. "We have to go back to town, get help, get the constable." But even as he said it, I could see in his eyes that he knew as well as I did that by the time we reached Nome and returned with help, it would be too late. The temperature was still dropping, the storm was getting worse, and a small child couldn't survive much longer in these conditions, no matter who was with her. I grabbed Henrik's arm, feeling the tremor in his muscles that spoke of age and exhaustion, and bone-deep fear. "We're not going back," I said firmly, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. "We're going to follow these tracks, and we're going to find Sarah tonight before it's too late." What I didn't say, what I couldn't bring myself to voice, was my growing suspicion that whoever had taken Sarah hadn't done it to help her, they had taken her to hurt her, or worse. The trail led us north, away from Nome and deeper into the wilderness, that stretched endlessly toward the Arctic Ocean. With each step, I could feel civilization falling away behind us, leaving us alone with the howling wind and the vast indifference of the frozen landscape. The footprints were easier to follow now, as whoever was ahead of us had abandoned any attempt at concealment and was simply pushing forward through the storm. Henrik moved like a man possessed, his earlier exhaustion forgotten in the face of his desperate need to reach his granddaughter. I stayed close behind him, my lantern casting dancing shadows on the snow-laden trees that seemed to reach for us with skeletal fingers. The cold was becoming unbearable, seeping through my heaviest clothing and making my fingers numb despite my thick mittens. I could feel ice forming in my eyelashes, and each breath burned my lungs like fire. But I pressed on, driven by the image of Sarah's empty desk, and the memory of her bright eyes looking up at me with trust and admiration. Somewhere ahead of us in the darkness, a little girl was depending on adults to save her, and I would rather die in this frozen wasteland than let her down. The wind carried strange sounds, creaking trees, shifting snow, and sometimes what might have been voices calling from far away, though I couldn't tell if they were real or just the products of my imagination and the disorienting effects of extreme cold. We had been walking for over an hour when Henrik suddenly stopped, his body going rigid as he stared ahead into the swirling snow. "There," he whispered, pointing with a shaking hand toward something I couldn't see. I raised my lantern higher, squinting against the storm, and gradually made out the dark outline of a structure rising from the white landscape like a ghost. It was a cabin, smaller and more primitive than Henrik's, built of rough logs and chinked with moss and mud. No light showed in its single window, and no smoke rose from its stone chimney, but the footprints we had been following led straight to its weathered wooden door. The building looked abandoned, forgotten, the kind of place that might have been built during the gold rush and left to rot when the dreams of easy fortune faded. But as we approached, I could see that someone had been using it recently. There were fresh cuts in the firewood stacked against one wall, and the path to the door had been kept clear of snow. Henrik grabbed my arm with fingers like ice, his grip so tight it hurt even through my heavy coat. "That's Magnus Larsson's old trapping. Cabin?" he said, his voice filled with a dread that made my blood run cold. "He used to bring his furs here before—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but I could see in his eyes that whatever history existed between Henrik and this Magnus Larsson was dark and dangerous, and that Sarah had somehow been caught in the middle of it. I had heard the name Magnus Larsson, whispered in the streets of Nome, always in connection with stories that people didn't like to tell in daylight. He was a trapper and trader from the old days, a man who some said had made his real fortune not from fur or gold, but from darker enterprises that thrived in the lawless wilderness beyond the reach of civilization. The respectable people of Nome spoke of him with the kind of fear usually reserved for wolves or avalanches, a natural disaster that might strike without warning. But what made my skin crawl was the realization that Henrik knew this man, knew him well enough to recognize his tracks, knew where his cabin was hidden in the vast emptiness of the Alaskan wilderness. As we crept closer to the dark building, I began to understand that Sarah's disappearance was not a random crime, but something that had been planned, something connected to secrets from Henrik's past that had finally caught up with him in the most terrible way possible. The wind howled around the cabin like the voices of the damned, and I could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching us from the darkness beyond our lantern's reach. But there was no time for fear, no time for questions about the twisted history that had led us to this moment. Somewhere inside that cabin was an 8-year-old girl who needed us to be brave enough to face whatever waited in the shadows. As we reached the cabin's door, I could hear sounds from inside, the crackle of a fire, the murmur of voices, and something else that made my heart race with terror. It was the sound of a child sobbing, quiet and hopeless, the kind of crying that came from someone who had given up hope of rescue. Henrik's face in the lantern light was terrible to see, twisted with rage and grief and a guilt that seemed to be tearing him apart from the inside. "This is my fault," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm. "All my fault. I thought I could keep her safe, thought the past would never catch up with us here. But Magnus never forgives, never forgets." He reached for the door handle with a hand that shook from more than just cold, and I realized that whatever we found inside this cabin would change all of our lives forever. The wind seemed to hold its breath as Henrik lifted the wooden latch, and in that moment of perfect silence, I heard Sarah's voice, weak but unmistakably alive, calling for her grandfather from somewhere in the darkness beyond the door. But I also heard something else, something that made every nerve in my body scream with warning, the sound of a rifle being cocked, and a man's low laughter that promised violence and pain and revenge that had been 20 years in the making. The door opened before Henrik could touch the handle, and I found myself staring into the barrel of a Winchester rifle held by a man whose face looked like it had been carved from the same unforgiving stone as the Alaskan mountains. Magnus Larsson was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered features that spoke of decades spent in the wilderness, but his pale blue eyes held a coldness that had nothing to do with the Arctic climate, and everything to do with the darkness that lived in his soul. His graying beard was streaked with ice, and his heavy fur coat made him look like some ancient predator that had emerged from the frozen wasteland to claim its prey. "Henrik Olsen," he said, his voice carrying the lilting accent of the old country but twisted with 20 years of bitter hatred. I wondered when you would finally come calling. Behind him, the cabin's interior was lit by the dancing flames of a stone fireplace, casting shifting shadows on the rough log walls that made the whole scene look like something from a nightmare. The smell of wood smoke and unwashed bodies drifted out into the night, along with something else, the metallic scent of fear that clung to the air like frost. But what made my heart clench with terror was the sight of Sarah, sitting bound and gagged in a wooden chair near the fire, her cornflower blue eyes wide with terror above the dirty cloth that covered her mouth, looking at her grandfather with a mixture of hope and desperate fear that broke something inside my chest. "Let her go, Magnus," Henrik said, his voice steady despite the rifle pointed at his heart. "This is between you and me. Always has been. The child has nothing to do with what happened in Dawson City." The mention of Dawson City made Magnus's eyes narrow, and I saw his finger tighten on the trigger of the Winchester. Whatever had happened between these two men in that legendary Gold Rush town, it was something terrible enough to drive one of them to kidnap an innocent child 20 years later. I stood frozen behind Henrik, my lantern casting a weak circle of light in the doorway, knowing that one wrong move could end Sarah's life and ours as well. The wind howled around the cabin like the voices of all the prospectors who had died in the Klondike, seeking gold and finding only frozen death in the endless white wilderness. Magnus stepped aside slightly, gesturing with his rifle for us to enter the cabin, his movements controlled and predatory. "Oh, but she has everything to do with it," he said, his voice soft and dangerous. "She's your granddaughter, Henrik. Your blood, and blood pays for blood in this country. That's the law out here, the only law that matters." As we stepped into the suffocating warmth of the cabin, I realized we had walked straight into a trap that had been decades in the making, and that our chances of leaving this place alive were growing smaller with each passing second. The cabin's interior was sparse and functional, furnished with the bare necessities of survival in the harsh Alaskan wilderness. A rough wooden table sat in the center of the room, covered with the remnants of a simple meal, while animal pelts hung from the walls like the ghosts of creatures that had died to feed Magnus's bitter existence. Sarah sat near the fireplace, her small form dwarfed by the heavy ropes that bound her to the chair, and I could see bruises on her wrists where she had struggled against her bonds. Her eyes found mine across the room, and I tried to communicate, with my expression that everything would be all right, even though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. Magnus moved around us like a wolf circling wounded prey, the rifle never wavering from its target, his pale eyes reflecting the firelight with an intensity that spoke of madness barely held in check. "Do you remember what you did to my brother, Henrik?" he asked, his voice conversational but underlaid with a rage that had been simmering for 2 decades. "Do you remember Thomas? Sweet, trusting Thomas, who followed you up to that claim on Bonanza Creek because he believed your lies about striking it rich?" Henrik's face went white, and I saw his hands clench into fists at his sides as old memories surfaced like bodies, rising from a frozen lake. The fire crackled and spat, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and outside, the wind continued its endless howling, as if nature itself was mourning the tragedy that was about to unfold in this God-forsaken place. "It wasn't supposed to happen that way," Henrik whispered, his voice breaking with the weight of 20 years' worth of guilt. "The mine shaft collapsed, Magnus. It was an accident. I swear on my mother's grave, it was an accident." But Magnus laughed, a sound like breaking glass that made Sarah whimper behind her gag and caused every nerve in my body to scream with alarm. "An accident?" he repeated, his voice rising with each word. "You left him there, Henrik. Left him buried under 1,000 tons of rock and ice while you took his share of the gold and ran. You didn't even try to dig him out. Didn't even mark the grave so I could find his body when I came looking." The truth hit me like a physical blow. Henrik had been involved in his partner's death during the Klondike Gold Rush, and Magnus had spent the last 20 years tracking him down for revenge. I looked at the old Norwegian prospector I had known. For 3 years, the gentle grandfather who doted on Sarah and told stories of the old country, and realized I had never known him at all. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in on us like a coffin, while the fire threw our shadows against the rough logs in shapes that looked like dancing demons celebrating the revelation of long-buried sins. Sarah's muffled sobs were the only sound besides the crackling flames and the wind that seemed to be calling for justice from beyond the grave. Magnus reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch, old and worn, that clinked with the unmistakable sound of gold. Nuggets. "This was Thomas's share," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Found it in your cabin back in Dawson, after you disappeared like the coward you are. Took me 15 years to track you down to this godforsaken place, and another 5 to figure out how to make you pay." He dumped the contents of the pouch onto the table, and the firelight caught the gleam of raw gold, nuggets, and flakes that represented a fortune by any measure. "But I realized that killing you quick wouldn't be justice," Magnus continued, his pale eyes fixed on Henrik's anguished face. "Thomas suffered down there in the dark, cold, and alone, probably took hours to die. So I decided you needed to know what it felt like to lose someone you loved, to watch them suffer and not be able to help." The full horror of Magnus's plan became clear to me then. He didn't just want Henrik's life, he wanted his soul, wanted him to experience the same helpless agony Magnus had felt when he learned his brother was dead. The wind outside grew stronger, rattling the cabin's windows, and making the flames dance wildly in the fireplace, as if the spirits of the dead were gathering to witness this final accounting of old debts. Sarah's terrified eyes moved between the 3 adults in the room, and I knew that whatever happened next, this night would scar her forever, assuming she lived to see another dawn. I had been silent through this terrible revelation, my mind racing, to find some way to save Sarah and get us all out of this cabin alive. But as Magnus began to pace around the room like a caged animal, I realized that appealing to his humanity was useless. 20 years of hatred had burned away whatever compassion he might once have possessed. "Please," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Sarah is just a child. She doesn't deserve to pay for something that happened before she was born." Magnus turned his cold gaze on me, and I felt like I was looking into the eyes of a man who had already died inside, whose heart had been frozen solid by years of bitter revenge. "And my Thomas was just a boy of 19, he replied, his voice soft but deadly. "Didn't deserve to die in the dark either, but that didn't stop your friend here from leaving him to rot." He raised the rifle until it was pointed directly at Sarah's small form, and I saw Henrik's face crumble as he realized his past had finally caught up with him in the most terrible way possible. The fire popped and hissed, sending sparks up the chimney, while outside the storm seemed to grow more violent, as if the very elements were responding to the drama unfolding in this isolated cabin. But then I heard something that made hope flicker in my chest like a candle flame, the distant sound of dogs barking carried on the wind from somewhere not far away, and I realized that we might not be as alone in this wilderness as Magnus believed. The sound of the dogs grew louder, accompanied by the distinctive crack of a whip and the shouted commands of a musher driving his team through the storm. Magnus heard it too, his head turning toward the door with an expression of surprise and growing alarm. "Expecting company?" Henrik asked, and for the first time since we had entered the cabin, I heard a note of hope in his voice. Magnus cursed, in what sounded like Norwegian, and moved to the window, peering out into the swirling snow while keeping his rifle trained on us. "Nobody should be out in this weather," he muttered, but I could see the uncertainty in his posture, the way his carefully laid plans were beginning to unravel in the face of this unexpected development. The barking grew closer, and I could hear the distinctive sound of sled runners cutting through the packed snow, the panting of dogs pushed to their limits in the brutal conditions. Sarah had heard it too, and her eyes brightened with the first real hope I had seen since we found her, though the gag prevented her from calling out to whoever was approaching through the storm. Magnus moved away from the window, his face twisted with rage and frustration, as he realized his carefully planned revenge was about to be interrupted. "If any of you make a sound," he hissed, pressing the rifle barrel against Sarah's temple, "the child dies first." But as the dog team drew closer to the cabin, I found myself holding my breath and praying to whatever gods might be listening in this frozen corner of hell, hoping against hope that salvation was racing toward us through the Arctic night on, the runners of a sled. The dogs fell silent outside the cabin, and I could hear voices, at least 2 men talking in low tones as they secured their team and approached the door. Magnus's face had gone pale beneath his weathered tan, and sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cold that seeped through the cabin's walls like a living thing. He gestured frantically for Henrik and me to move away from the door, while keeping his rifle pointed at Sarah's head, his finger white with tension on the trigger. "Remember," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "One word, and she dies." The footsteps outside grew closer, heavy boots crunching through the snow, and then came a knock on the door. Not the tentative rap of someone seeking shelter, but the authoritative pounding of men who expected to be admitted without question. "Magnus Larsson!" a voice called out, strong and commanding despite the howling wind. "This is Constable Morrison from Nome. We know you're in there, and we know you have the child." My heart leaped with relief and terror simultaneously. Help had arrived, but Magnus was desperate now, cornered like a wounded animal, and desperate men were capable of anything. The rifle trembled in his hands as he stared at the door, 20 years of planning crumbling around him like ice in the spring thaw, and I knew that the next few minutes would determine whether any of us lived to see the morning sun rise over the frozen wasteland that had become our battleground. Magnus's eyes darted between the door and his hostages like a cornered wolf calculating its last desperate escape, and I could see the madness that 20 years of obsession had carved into, his soul finally breaking free of whatever restraints had held it in check. The rifle in his hands shook with more than just the cold, and sweat ran down his face despite the frigid air that leaked through every crack in the cabin's weathered walls. "This isn't how it was supposed to end," he whispered, his voice cracking, with the weight of his crumbling revenge. 20 years I've waited. 20 years I've planned. And now these bastards think they can just walk in here and stop me from getting justice for Thomas. The pounding on the door came again, more insistent this time, followed by Constable Morrison's voice cutting through the storm like a blade. "We have the cabin surrounded, Larson. There's nowhere to run and the weather's getting worse. Let the child go and we can talk about this like civilized men." But Magnus laughed, a sound like breaking ice that made Sarah whimper behind her gag and sent chills down my spine that had nothing to do with the Arctic temperature. The firelight danced across his weathered features, turning his face into a mask of shadows and madness, and I realized that civilization was the last thing on his mind as his carefully constructed world collapsed around him like a house of cards in a blizzard. "Civilized men!" Magnus shouted toward the door, his voice rising to a pitch that spoke of sanity finally snapping under the pressure of decades-old grief and rage. Where was civilization when Thomas was dying in that mine shaft? Where was justice when this murderer took my brother's gold and disappeared into the wilderness like smoke? He pressed the rifle barrel harder against Sarah's temple, and I saw her small body tense with terror as tears streamed down her cheeks. Henrik stepped forward, his weathered hands raised in a gesture of surrender, his face aged a decade in the space of a few minutes. "Magnus, please," he said, his Norwegian accent thick with emotion. "I'll confess everything. Tell them about the mine, about Thomas, about the gold. I'll face whatever punishment they give me, but please don't hurt the child." The old prospector's voice broke on the last word, and I could see the weight of 20 years' worth of guilt crushing down on him like an avalanche. Outside, I could hear more voices, the constable's men spreading out around the cabin, their boots crunching through the snow as they took up positions in the howling darkness. The wind rattled the windows with renewed fury, as if nature itself was protesting the violence that was about to unfold in this remote corner of the world. But Magnus was beyond reason now, his pale eyes reflecting the firelight with the intensity of a man who had stared too long into the abyss and found it staring back. The constable's voice came again, closer this time, as if he had moved right up to the door. "Larson, I know what happened to your brother. I know about the mine collapse, about the gold, about everything. But taking it out on an innocent child won't bring Thomas back." Magnus's face twisted with fury at the mention of his brother's name, and for a moment I thought he might pull the trigger right then and there. "Don't you dare speak his name!" he screamed, spittle flying from his lips as 20 years of suppressed anguish erupted like a geyser. "You weren't there! You didn't see him before he left for that cursed claim, talking about all the things he was going to do with his share of the gold, all the dreams he had." The rifle trembled in his hands as memories flooded back, and I could see the boy he had once been beneath the hardened exterior, a younger brother who had worshipped Thomas, who had never gotten over losing him in the dark depths of a Canadian mine shaft. Sarah's eyes were wide with terror, but I could see something else there too. The same fierce intelligence that made her such a remarkable student, working to understand the adult drama that had engulfed her in its deadly embrace. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up the chimney, while outside the storm seemed to be reaching a crescendo that matched the violence brewing inside the cabin. But then Henrik did something that surprised everyone in the room. He began to tell the truth, his voice cutting through the tension like a confession whispered in church. "You're right, Magnus," Henrik said, his voice steady despite the tears that froze on his cheeks. "I was a coward. When the shaft collapsed, when I heard Thomas screaming from under all that rock and ice, I panicked. I tried to dig him out at first, I swear I did, but the whole mountain seemed to be coming down and His voice broke, and he had to swallow hard before continuing. "I ran, Magnus. I took what gold I could carry, and I ran. Told myself there was nothing I could do, that he was probably already dead. But I could hear him calling my name as I left, could hear him begging for help, and I've heard that voice every night for 20 years. The confession hung in the air like smoke from the fire, and I could see its effect on Magnus. The rage in his eyes flickered, replaced for a moment by something that might have been surprise or even pity. Sarah had stopped crying, her attention focused on her grandfather with the intensity of a child trying to understand how the adult world could be so complicated and cruel. The wind outside seemed to quiet slightly, as if even nature was holding its breath to hear this long-overdue accounting of sins committed in the frozen wilderness of the Klondike. But I could see that Magnus was still balanced on the knife's edge of violence, his finger still tight on the trigger, the rifle still pressed against Sarah's head like a promise of death that could be fulfilled with the slightest pressure. "You left him to die alone," Magnus whispered, his voice barely audible above the crackling fire. 26 hours it took the rescue team to dig him out, and he was alive for most of it. Alive and calling for his partner, calling for you. The words hit Henrik like physical blows, and I watched the old man's face crumble, under the weight of knowledge he had tried to bury for 2 decades. The coroner said he could have lived if someone had stayed to help, if someone had tried to get him water, tried to keep him warm. But you were already 50 miles away, weren't you? Already spending his share of the gold in some Dawson City saloon. Magnus's voice grew stronger with each word, fed by the grief and rage that had sustained him through 20 years of hunting. The constable's voice came through the door again, more urgent now. "Larson, we can hear you talking. Let's work this out. Nobody else has to die tonight." But Magnus seemed not to hear him, lost in the memories of his brother's death and the years he had spent planning this moment. I could see Sarah growing weaker, the stress and cold taking their toll on her small body, and I knew that time was running out for all of us. The fire was burning lower, the shadows growing longer and darker, and outside the storm showed no signs of abating. We were trapped in this cabin at the edge of the world with a madman whose thirst for revenge had consumed everything human. Inside him, something crashed against the cabin's back wall, and Magnus spun around, momentarily distracted from his hostages. In that instant, Henrik lunged forward, his weathered hands reaching for the rifle with the desperate strength of a man trying to save his granddaughter's life. But Magnus was younger and quicker, and the two men crashed into the table, scattering the gold nuggets across the floor like drops of frozen sunlight. The rifle discharged with a deafening roar that echoed off the cabin walls, and the bullet splintered the wooden door just as it burst open to reveal Constable Morrison and two deputies, their faces grim with determination and their weapons drawn. Sarah's chair toppled over in the struggle, and she hit the floor hard, her small body rolling toward the fireplace as the two old men fought with the fury of decades-old hatred finally coming to a head. I dove towards Sarah, my hands working frantically to untie the ropes that bound her while chaos erupted around us. Magnus screaming in Norwegian, Henrik grunting with effort and pain, the constable shouting orders to his men as they tried to separate the combatants without getting shot themselves. The cabin filled with gun smoke and the acrid smell of violence, while outside the wind howled like all the ghosts of the Klondike crying for justice. But as I finally freed Sarah from her bonds and pulled the gag from her mouth, I realized that the worst was yet to come. Magnus had broken free from Henrik's grasp and was reaching for a pistol that had been hidden under his coat, his eyes wild with the desperate fury of a man who would rather die than see his revenge denied. The next few seconds stretched like hours in my memory. Each detail burned into my mind with the clarity that comes only in moments of mortal terror. Magnus's hand closed around the pistol's grip just as Constable Morrison raised his own weapon, the two men staring at each other across the smoke-filled cabin like gunfighters in some penny dreadful novel. Henrik lay gasping on the floor beside the overturned table, blood seeping from a gash on his forehead where he had struck the wooden edge during their struggle. Sarah clung to me with desperate strength, her small body shaking with sobs and exhaustion and relief at finally being free from her bonds. "It doesn't have to end this way, Magnus," the constable said, his voice calm and steady despite the tension that filled the air like electricity before a lightning strike. "Your brother's death was a tragedy, but killing innocent people won't. Bring him back. Put down the gun, and let's walk out of here together." For a moment, I thought Magnus might listen, might see the futility of continuing down a path that could only lead to more death and suffering. His pale eyes moved from the constable to Henrik to Sarah and finally to me, and I could see the human being he had once been struggling with the monster that 20 years of hatred had created. The fire popped loudly in the sudden silence, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, and in that brief flash of light I saw Magnus make his choice, not the choice of a civilized man seeking justice, but the choice of a creature consumed by rage and grief and the terrible need to make someone pay for his brother's lonely death in a collapsed mine shaft 20 years ago. The gunshot, when it came, was not the sharp crack I had expected, but a dull boom that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. Magnus had not aimed at the constable or at Henrik or even at Sarah and me. Instead, he had turned the pistol on himself, pressing the barrel against his temple with the same finality he had shown when threatening my student. His body crumpled to the floor beside the scattered gold nuggets, his pale eyes staring sightlessly at the rough log ceiling as blood pooled beneath his head like spilled wine. The silence that followed was profound and terrible, broken only by Sarah's quiet sobbing and the endless howling of the wind outside the cabin walls. Constable Morrison lowered his weapon, his face grim with the kind of weariness that comes from seeing too much violence in a harsh land where justice was often served at the end of a gun barrel. "It's over," he said simply. But I knew that wasn't true. The echoes of this night would follow all of us for the rest of our lives, and Sarah would carry the scars of what she had witnessed into whatever future awaited her beyond the frozen wilderness of Nome. As the constable's men secured the scene and tended to Henrik's wounds, I held the little girl close and stared out the cabin's window at the storm that showed no signs of abating, wondering how we would ever find our way back to the world of morning lessons and afternoon recitations and all the simple, innocent things that seemed so impossibly far away from this cabin at the edge of the world where the ghosts of the past had finally claimed their due. The silence that followed Magnus's final gunshot was broken by Sarah's violent shivering, and I realized that the shock and cold were taking a dangerous toll on her small body. Her lips had turned blue despite the cabin's warmth, and her breathing was shallow and rapid, signs that I recognized from my basic medical training as the onset of exposure and trauma. Constable Morrison immediately took charge of the situation, his years of experience in the Alaska Territory showing as he directed his men to secure the scene while prioritizing the living over the dead. "Deputy Walsh, get that fire built up higher," he ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos with calm authority. "Deputy Clark, check Mr. Olson's head wound and see if we have any medical supplies in the sled." The constable knelt beside Sarah and me, his weathered face softening as he looked at the frightened child who had been through more terror in one night than most people experienced in a lifetime. "You're safe now, little one," he said gently, his voice carrying the kind of paternal warmth that came from years of dealing with traumatized victims in this harsh frontier town. But even as he spoke those comforting words, I could see in his eyes the same concern I felt. We were still miles from Nome, trapped in a storm that showed no signs of letting up, and Sarah needed medical attention that none of us were qualified to provide. The wind outside continued its relentless assault on the cabin, and I knew that our rescue was far from complete. Henrik struggled to sit up despite the blood that continued to seep from the gash on his forehead, his face gray with pain and the crushing weight of 20 years' worth of secrets finally exposed to the light. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion and exhaustion. "My little star, are you hurt? Did he—" He couldn't finish the question, but I could see the terrible fear in his eyes, not just for Sarah's physical well-being, but for the psychological damage that this night might have inflicted on her young mind. I helped Sarah over to her grandfather, watching as she wrapped her small arms around his neck and buried her face in his shoulder, her quiet sobs muffled against his heavy coat. "I'm okay, Grandpa," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "I was scared, but I knew you would come for me. I knew you wouldn't leave me like—" She trailed off, and I realized that she had heard and understood more of Magnus's accusations than I had hoped. The truth about her grandfather's past was now part of her reality, and I wondered how a child's mind would process the knowledge that the man she trusted most in the world had once abandoned someone to die in a dark, frozen hole in the ground. Deputy Walsh had built the fire up to a roaring blaze, but the heat seemed insufficient against the supernatural cold that had settled over all of us, a chill that had as much to do with the events we had witnessed as with the Arctic temperatures. Outside, Constable Morrison moved to examine Magnus's body, his professional detachment a stark contrast to the emotional chaos that surrounded us. 20 years he's been hunting your grandfather," he said to Sarah, though his words were clearly meant for all of us. "Started tracking him right after the Klondike coroner's report came out, listing Thomas Larson as a victim of mind collapse and partner abandonment. Magnus spent every penny he had hiring private investigators, following false leads from Vancouver to Anchorage. He pulled a worn leather journal from Magnus's coat pocket, its pages filled with meticulous notes and sketches that documented a decades-long obsession. "Look at this," he continued, flipping through pages covered with maps, newspaper clippings, and photographs of Henrik taken from a distance. "He's been watching you folks for months, learning your routines, planning this, whole thing down to the last detail. The journal fell open to a page that showed a detailed layout of Henrik's cabin, with Sarah's bedroom window circled in red ink and notes about the best time to take her without being seen. My stomach churned as I realized how long Sarah had been in danger, how many nights Magnus had probably crept around their property like a wolf stalking its prey, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The constable closed the journal with a snap that sounded like breaking bones, and I could see in his weathered face the same disgust I felt at this violation of an innocent child's safety. "We need to get moving," Deputy Clark announced from his position by the door, where he had been monitoring the storm's progress. "Weather's getting worse, and we've got maybe 2 hours before this blizzard makes travel impossible. Even with the dogs." He was right. I could hear the wind intensifying outside, and the cabin's walls creaked and groaned under the assault of what sounded like hurricane-force gusts. Constable Morrison nodded grimly, his years of Alaska experience telling him what we all knew but didn't want to acknowledge. Staying in this cabin meant risking being trapped for days with insufficient food and supplies while attempting to travel in these conditions could mean freezing to death before we made it halfway back to Nome. "Henrik, can you travel?" the constable asked, examining the old prospector's head wound with the practiced eye of someone who had seen plenty of frontier injuries. Henrik nodded weakly, though I could see the effort it cost him just to focus his eyes. "I'll make it," he said, his voice gaining strength as he looked at Sarah. "I won't let anything happen to her, not again." But I could see the doubt in the constable's face, the calculation of risks and odds that came with being responsible for other people's lives in a land where a single mistake could mean death for everyone involved. Sarah had stopped shivering quite as violently, but her color was still poor, and I knew that the combination of physical exhaustion and emotional trauma was taking a toll that might not be immediately visible, but could prove dangerous in the hours ahead. The deputies worked with efficient haste to prepare for our departure, gathering the few supplies that Magnus had stored in the cabin and loading them onto the sled that waited outside in the howling darkness. I helped Sarah into the heaviest coat we could find among Magnus's belongings, a fur parka that was far too large for her, but would provide crucial protection against the killing cold. "Miss Catherine," she said quietly as I adjusted the hood. Around her small face, "Is Grandpa going to jail for what he did to that man's brother?" The question hit me like a physical blow, not just because of its mature understanding of the situation, but because I didn't have a good answer for her. "I don't know, sweetheart," I said honestly, tucking her blonde braids inside the parka's warm lining. "But I know that people sometimes make terrible mistakes when they're scared, and your grandfather has been carrying the weight of his mistake for a very long time." She nodded solemnly, her cornflower blue eyes reflecting a wisdom that no 8-year-old should possess. And I realized that this night had aged all of us in ways that couldn't be measured in hours or days. The storm outside seemed to sense our preparations for departure, increasing its fury as if determined to trap us in this place, where so much blood had been spilled and so many secrets had been exposed. But Constable Morrison was already moving toward the door, his hand on the latch, ready to lead us back into the frozen hell that lay between the cabin and the safety of Nome. The moment we stepped outside, the full force of the Arctic storm hit us like a living thing, the wind so strong it nearly knocked me off my feet and so cold it stole my breath despite the heavy scarf wrapped around my face. The sled dogs were barely visible through the swirling snow, their thick fur coated with ice as they huddled together for warmth. But they rose to their feet with the disciplined obedience of animals bred for this harsh work. Constable Morrison and his deputies had rigged a shelter on the sled using canvas and rope, creating a small protected space where Sarah and Henrik could ride while the rest of us followed on snowshoes through the trackless wilderness. "Stay close," the constable shouted over the howling wind. "If anyone falls behind, the whole group stops. Nobody gets left behind tonight." His words carried extra weight given what we had just learned about Henrik's past. and I could see the old prospector's face tighten with pain that had nothing to do with his head wound. Sarah was bundled so thoroughly in furs and blankets that only her eyes were visible, but those eyes were alert and focused, watching everything with the intensity of someone who had learned that safety was never guaranteed, and that the adults around her were capable of both great courage and terrible cowardice. The dogs lunged forward into the storm with the constable running alongside them, his lantern casting a weak circle of light that was immediately swallowed by the swirling snow, and I found myself following that tiny beacon into the darkness, praying that it would be enough to guide us home through the longest night any of us had ever experienced. The journey back to Nome became a test of endurance that pushed all of us to the very limits of human capability. Each step a victory against the elements that seemed determined to claim us as their own. The wind was so strong that it sometimes lifted me off my feet entirely, forcing me to grab onto the sled rope to keep from being blown away into the white void that surrounded us on all sides. My snowshoes, designed for normal winter travel, felt inadequate against the deep drifts that the storm had created, and more than once I found myself floundering in snow up to my waist while the others waited for me to struggle free. Henrik, despite his injury, showed remarkable resilience, his old prospector's instincts guiding him through terrain that would have been impossible to navigate without decades of wilderness experience. But I could see the toll the night was taking on him, not just physically but emotionally, as the weight of his confession and the violence we had witnessed settled over him like a shroud. Sarah, protected in her canvas shelter, called out encouragement to all of us whenever the wind died down enough for her voice to be heard, her childish words of support providing a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the human spirit's refusal to surrender to despair. The constable pressed forward with the relentless determination of a man who had never lost a person under his protection, and wasn't about to start now, his lantern swinging back and forth like a metronome marking time in a symphony of survival that would either end in triumph or tragedy before the sun rose over the frozen wasteland of the Alaska Territory. As we crested a small hill that I recognized as being about halfway to Nome, the storm suddenly intensified beyond anything I had experienced in my 3 years in Alaska, the wind reaching velocities that seemed to defy natural law. The sled dogs struggled against their harnesses, their training warring with their instinct to find shelter and wait out the worst of the weather, while Constable Morrison fought to keep them moving forward through conditions that had become genuinely life-threatening. "We're not going to make it!" Deputy Walsh shouted, his words barely audible above the howling gale. "We need to find shelter and wait this out." But the constable shook his head grimly, pointing toward a faint glow on the horizon that might have been the lights of Nome, or might have been nothing more than wishful thinking, translated into visual hallucination. "If we stop now, we'll freeze," he shouted back. "The only way out is through." Sarah's voice came from the sled, weak but determined. "I can see lights, Miss Catherine. I can see the town." Whether she was telling the truth or simply trying to give us hope didn't matter. Her words provided the inspiration we needed to take the next step, and then the next, through a storm that had become a test not just of our physical endurance, but of our willingness to believe that somewhere ahead of us, beyond the wall of white that seemed to stretch into eternity, lay warmth and safety, and the promise of seeing another dawn in a world where children could sleep peacefully in their beds without fear of the ghosts that haunted the frozen wilderness, of men's guilty consciences. The lights Sarah had seen through the storm were indeed the oil lamps and electric bulbs of Nome, glowing like earthbound stars in the pre-dawn darkness. And when we finally stumbled into the town's main street, I felt my legs give out beneath me with relief so profound it was almost painful. Dr. Harrison was waiting for us at his clinic, having been alerted by radio of our situation, and his weathered hands worked with practiced efficiency to examine Sarah and Henrik while I sat in a corner chair, my body finally allowing itself to acknowledge the exhaustion and terror of the past 8 hours. Sarah's physical condition was better than any of us had dared hope, cold, tired and traumatized, but with no signs of frostbite or serious injury that would leave permanent damage. Henrik required 12 stitches for his head wound, but the doctor pronounced him surprisingly fit for a man his age who had just endured such an ordeal. "You're all incredibly lucky," Dr. Harrison said as he finished bandaging Henrik's forehead. "Another hour in that storm, and we might have been planning funerals instead of recovery." But even as he spoke those comforting words, I could see in his eyes the same knowledge that haunted all of us. Luck had played only a small part in our survival, and the real cost of this night's events was yet to be fully calculated. The northern lights began to dance across the sky outside the clinic windows, sheets of green and gold fire that seemed to mock the human drama that had unfolded beneath their eternal watch, reminding us that in this vast wilderness, individual lives and deaths were nothing more than brief sparks in an endless Arctic night. As dawn broke over Nome 2 days later, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold that made the recent violence seem like something from a nightmare, I found myself sitting beside Sarah's bed in the clinic, watching her sleep and marveling at the resilience of children in the face of trauma that would break many adults. She had slept for nearly 36 hours straight, her body and mind healing from the ordeal in the way that only the young can manage. But I knew that the real recovery would take much longer than a few days of rest. Henrik sat in the chair, across from me, his bandaged head a stark reminder of how close we had all come to death in that remote cabin. His weathered hands folded in his lap as he watched his granddaughter with eyes that held 20 years' worth of guilt and the desperate hope of redemption. "She asked me this morning if I was a murderer," he said quietly, his Norwegian accent thick with emotion. 8 years old, and she had to ask her grandfather if he was a killer. The words hung between us like smoke, and I could see the weight they carried, the terrible burden of explaining to a child that the adults they trust are capable of both great love and great cowardice. Outside the window, the people of Nome went about their daily business, unaware that the quiet old prospector who had lived among them for 3 years was actually a man whose past was stained with the blood of abandonment and whose future now hung in the balance of territorial justice. But what troubled me most was not Henrik's guilt, but the realization that Sarah would have to live with the knowledge of it for the rest of her life, and that no amount of love or protection could shield her from the harsh truth about human nature that she had learned in that storm-lashed cabin at the edge of the world. Constable Morrison arrived at the clinic that afternoon with a telegraph from the territorial authorities in Fairbanks, and the grave expression on his face told me that Henrik's confession had set in motion a legal process that would change all our lives forever. "They want him in Fairbanks for a formal hearing," the constable said, his voice carefully neutral as he delivered news that we all knew was coming. "The Klondike incident falls under Canadian jurisdiction, but there are questions about the gold he brought to Alaska, whether it was legitimately his or stolen from his dead partner." Henrik nodded slowly, his face showing no surprise but only the resigned acceptance of a man who had been running from justice for 20 years and was finally ready to stop. "What about Sarah?" I asked, the question that had been burning in my mind since the moment we learned the truth about her grandfather's past. "She has no other family, no one else to care for her." The constable's expression softened as he looked at the sleeping child, and I could see the same protective instinct that had driven him through the storm to rescue her still burning in his eyes. "That's going to be up to the territorial court," he said carefully. "But there are options, people in Nome who might be willing to take her in, give her a proper home." His words were meant to be comforting, but they felt like knives in my heart, as I realized that Sarah's ordeal was far from over. In fact, in many ways, it was just beginning, and the little girl who had already lost so much was about to lose the only family she had left in the world. That evening, as the northern lights painted the sky in spectacular curtains of green and blue fire, Henrik asked to speak with me privately on the clinic's front porch, where the bitter cold seemed somehow appropriate for the conversation we both knew was coming. "Miss Catherine," he said, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air, "I need to ask something of you, something that isn't fair, but that I'm going to ask anyway because there's no one else." He paused, gathering his courage for words that I could see were tearing him apart to speak. "Sarah trusts you more than anyone else in this world except me. And when they take me away to face what's coming, she's going to need someone who truly cares about her, not just some well-meaning strangers who see her as a charitable obligation." The implications of his request hit me like a physical blow. He was asking me to take responsibility for raising his granddaughter, to become the guardian of a child whose life had been shattered by the violent revelation of family secrets. "I'm just a schoolteacher, Henrik," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were inadequate. "I don't know anything about raising a child, especially one who's been through what Sarah has experienced." But Henrik's eyes held a desperation that went beyond his own fate, the desperate love of a grandfather who knew he had failed to protect the most precious thing in his life and was now trying to ensure her future from whatever cell or grave awaited him. "You saved her life," he said simply. "You risked everything to find her when I couldn't, and she knows that. Whatever happens to me, whatever punishment I face for what I did to Thomas Larson, I need to know that Sarah will be loved and protected and given the chance to grow up without the weight of my sins crushing her spirit." The next morning brought a telegram that changed everything, and as I read the words that had traveled across thousands of miles of wilderness to reach our remote corner of Alaska, I felt the ground shift beneath my feet like ice breaking up in the spring thaw. The message was from Thomas Larson himself, not his ghost, not his memory, but the living, breathing man whose death had driven his brother to 20 years of murderous obsession and ultimately to his own self-inflicted doom, in a cabin where the wind never stopped singing its mournful song. "Heard about Magnus. Stop alive in Vancouver. Stop mine collapse separated us. Stop Henrik saved my life. Stop coming to Nome. Stop Thomas Larson." I read the telegram 3 times before its meaning fully penetrated my shocked mind, then ran to find Henrik, who was sitting with Sarah in the clinic's main room, reading to her from a book of fairy tales as if he could somehow restore her innocence through the power of stories that always ended with justice triumphant and evil defeated. "Henrik," I said, my voice shaking with excitement and disbelief, "you need to see this." I handed him the telegram and watched his face transform as he read the impossible words, watched 20 years of guilt and self-hatred crumble like ice in the summer sun. "He's alive," Henrik whispered, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Dear God in heaven, Thomas is alive." Sarah looked up from her book with the quick intelligence that made her such a remarkable student, and I could see her young mind working to understand what this revelation meant for all of us. How the truth that had seemed so terrible and final could suddenly shift like the aurora borealis dancing across the night sky, revealing new patterns and possibilities that none of us had dared to imagine. The full story emerged over the following days as we waited for Thomas Larson to make the long journey from Vancouver to Nome, a tale of miscommunication and missed connections that had tragic consequences spanning 2 decades. The mine collapse had indeed separated the 2 partners, but while Henrik had assumed Thomas was dead and fled in panic with what gold he could carry, Thomas had been trapped in a different part of the shaft, barely alive, but rescued by another prospecting team 3 days later. Delirious from his injuries and suffering from memory loss caused by a head wound, Thomas had spent months in a Vancouver hospital with no recollection of his name or his life before the accident. By the time his memory returned, Henrik had vanished, without a trace, and Thomas's attempts to find his partner had been hampered by the chaos and transient nature of Gold Rush society. I spent years looking for him, Thomas explained when he finally arrived in Nome, a gray-haired man whose gentle demeanor was so different from his brother's violent obsession that it was hard to believe they had shared the same blood. I wanted to thank him for trying to dig me out, for staying with me as long as he could before the whole mountain started coming down. The irony was devastating. Magnus had spent 20 years hunting a man he believed was a murderer, when in reality Henrik had risked his own life trying to save his brother and had fled only when continued rescue efforts would have meant certain death for both of them. The gold Henrik had taken was his own share, earned through months of backbreaking labor in the frozen streams of the Klondike, and the theft that had driven Magnus to kidnap an innocent child had been nothing more than a traumatized man's desperate attempt to survive in a harsh land that showed no mercy to the weak or unlucky. Thomas's reunion with Henrik was a moment of grace that seemed to heal wounds that had festered for 2 decades, but it could not undo the damage that Magnus's obsession had inflicted on all our lives. Sarah watched the 2 old men embrace with tears streaming down their faces, her young mind struggling to process how the same events could be interpreted so differently by different people, how truth could be so complex and elusive that it destroyed one man while redeeming another. "What happens now?" she asked me that evening as we sat together watching the northern lights dance across the star-filled sky. "Does this mean Grandpa isn't in trouble anymore?" The legal questions were indeed complicated. While Henrik was cleared of any wrongdoing in Thomas's presumed death, there were still issues regarding the gold he had carried out of Canada and his failure to report what he believed was a mining fatality. But more importantly, there were the emotional scars that this ordeal had left on all of us, particularly on a little girl who had learned far too much about the capacity for both love and hatred that existed in the human heart. "It means your grandfather is a good man who made a mistake when he was scared and young," I told her, choosing my words carefully. "And it means that sometimes the stories we tell ourselves about the past aren't the whole truth. And that's why it's important to keep asking questions and looking for answers, even when it's hard." She nodded with the solemnity of someone far older than her 8 years, and I realized that this experience had changed her in ways that would shape the rest of her life, had given her a wisdom about human nature that most people never acquire, even in old age. As spring came to Nome and the endless winter finally began to loosen its grip on our remote corner of Alaska, I made a decision that surprised even myself. I formally adopted Sarah McKinnon, giving her not just a new name, but a new future filled with possibilities that extended far beyond the harsh wilderness that had shaped her early years. Henrik, cleared of all charges and reunited with the friend he thought he had killed, decided to remain in Nome rather than return to his old life as a wandering prospector, and Thomas joined him in rebuilding the cabin that had become a symbol of redemption rather than guilt. The 3 of us became an unlikely family, bound together by the shared experience of a night when the darkness had threatened to consume us all, but had ultimately revealed truths that set us free. Sarah flourished in this new stability, her natural intelligence and curiosity finding full expression in her studies and in the stories she began to write about her adventures in the Arctic wilderness. But sometimes, on nights when the northern lights painted the sky in sheets of ethereal fire, I would catch her staring out the window with the expression of profound thoughtfulness, and I knew she was remembering that terrible night when she learned that even the people we love most are capable of both great courage and great failure, and that the line between hero and villain is often thinner than the ice that covers the Bering Sea in the depths of an Alaskan winter. The empty desk in my schoolroom was filled again, but the child who sat there was no longer the innocent little girl who had once walked through blizzards for the simple joy of learning. She was someone who understood that knowledge comes with a price, that truth is often more complicated than we want it to be, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is forgiving someone for the mistakes they made when they were too frightened or too human to be the hero that circumstances demanded they become.